The morning air was crisp as I made my way through the woods, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots the only sound to accompany the stillness of the forest. I had always found solace in the solitude here, the trees, the rustling of wildlife, the occasional flash of a deer or rabbit darting by. The forest was my home, my sanctuary. Nothing ever seemed to disturb the quiet peace of this place. Or so I thought. It was in that early hour, just as the first rays of sunlight began to break through the canopy above, that I first heard it, a subtle rustling that broke the rhythm of the forest's usual hum. It was almost imperceptible, like a shift in the wind, but something told me that it was no ordinary noise. My instincts, honed from years of living with nature, told me to pause and listen. I stilled my steps, heart quickening slightly, and scanned the woods around me. A few birds perched on nearby branches, their songs echoing in the air, but nothing seemed out of place. The sound persisted, though, closer now, almost as if it was coming directly from the underbrush near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it might be a deer, or perhaps a wild boar. But then, through the thick brush, I saw it, large, looming, and unmistakable. A bear. But this was no ordinary bear. His massive frame seemed too heavy for the surroundings, too quiet. Most bears would avoid humans, yet here he was, slowly emerging from the trees and stepping into the clearing, his eyes wide and searching. What struck me most, however, was the look in his eyes. It was not the usual wary glance of a wild animal, nor the calculating gaze of a creature prepared to defend its territory. No, this was something else entirely, something desperate, almost pleading. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure of how to react. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Was he injured? Was he dangerous? But those thoughts faded quickly as I noticed something even more unsettling, a certain vulnerability about him. The bear, despite his size and strength, appeared worn out, exhausted. He took a step closer, his massive paws barely making a sound on the forest floor. And then, much to my astonishment, he did something I had never seen before. He lowered his head, almost as if bowing to me. A gesture of respect? Or something else? I couldn't quite fathom what was happening. Bears do not ask for help. They do not show weakness. And yet, here he was, standing before me, his eyes full of a silent plea. I swallowed hard, a mixture of confusion and curiosity stirring within me. What did this mean? Why was this BEA? And then, just as quickly as the thought crossed my mind, the answer arrived. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the bear, unsure of what to do next. My hand instinctively reached for my hunting knife, but I stopped myself. There was no threat here. Not in the way I had been trained to recognize. The bear, towering and powerful, showed no signs of aggression. Instead, his massive head remained bowed, as though he were waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. The forest around us was eerily still. Not a breeze stirred the leaves, and the usual rustling of wildlife had fallen silent, as if nature itself had stopped to watch this strange moment unfold. I had seen many bears in my time, but none like this one. There was a certain sadness in his eyes, an exhaustion that no wild creature should have to endure. He looked almost lost, as though something had shattered the balance of his world. I took a cautious step forward, then another. The bear's gaze never wavered from mine, but there was no fear in his eyes. He simply watched me, as if he knew or hoped that I was capable of understanding. "Are you lost?" I whispered, though I knew the question was absurd. The bear couldn't understand me, but I had said it out loud anyway. A ridiculous attempt to fill the silence between us. His response was a soft rumble, a low sound that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. It was not a growl. No, it was something different. A sound full of pain, full of need. I took another step forward, now just a few feet away from the creature. My breath caught in my chest. What was I doing? Bears did not seek humans for help. They were independent, fierce. This was madness. Yet, the desperation in his eyes told me there was more to this situation than simple curiosity. Then, without warning, the bear lifted his head and let out a gentle grunt, stepping back slightly and motioning with his massive head toward the woods. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a signal. He wanted me to follow. I hesitated, looking back at the trees. What was he leading me to? What kind of danger awaited us? But something deep inside me, the same part of me that had kept me alive all these years in the wild, urged me to trust him. I could not say why, but I did. I began walking, my boots crunching on the earth, and the bear followed me, his huge frame shadowing mine. As we moved deeper into the forest, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. What could a bear want from me? He wasn't acting like an animal in the wild. He wasn't hunting, he wasn't on the defensive. He was asking for something. And as much as I feared what might come next, I knew that I couldn't turn back now. The bear's pacing slowed as we neared the heart of the woods, where the trees grew taller, their trunks twisting and gnarled with age. The light here was dimmer, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth. The silence, though, was unsettling. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the bear stopped. He looked at me with those same pleading eyes, then turned to a small clearing just ahead. I followed his gaze and froze. There, lying in the midst of the clearing, were two other bears. One was a female, and the other, a cub. The mother lay motionless, her fur matted and dirty, while the cub was curled up, its tiny body trembling slightly as it breathed shallowly. I had seen enough in my time to know when something was wrong. This was not an ordinary injury. The bears were not merely resting or sleeping. They were sick. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. I crouched down beside the two bears, my heart pounding in my chest. The mother lay still, her body limp, as though every ounce of life had been drained from her. The cub, though still breathing, was barely able to lift its head, its small eyes glazed and unfocused. It was a sight I had never expected to witness. Wild animals rarely succumb to such vulnerability. They lived by instincts that kept them sharp and self-sufficient. But this was different. The bear that had led me here stood a few feet away, watching me with an intensity that told me this was no ordinary illness. The way he stood, head lowered, body tense, was a sign of deep distress. It was as if he were placing his trust in me, the human he had encountered only moments ago. I reached out, cautiously, to touch the mother's fur. It was colder than it should have been. She should have been warm, alive with the pulse of nature, but instead, there was an eerie stillness. I could smell it too, something faintly metallic in the air. A scent that made my skin crawl, something I couldn't place, but I had encountered before. A poison. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Poison? Could it be? The forest was not a place where such things were common. The predators in these woods had learned to avoid the traps humans set, and even the animals that ventured close to the outskirts of the settlements were wary. But this felt intentional. How did this happen? I muttered to myself, though I knew the bear could not understand. The cub stirred slightly, letting out a weak, almost inaudible whimper. My heart clenched in my chest. These creatures had been poisoned, and if I didn't do something, the same fate would surely befall the bear who had led me here. They were running out of time. I knelt beside the cub, my hands shaking as I examined the tiny creature. There was no visible injury, no obvious wound or sign of struggle. It seemed as though the poison was slowly creeping through their veins, paralyzing them from the inside out. The bear who had led me here, the father, paced back and forth, agitated. His eyes darted between the mother, the cub, and then to me, as if begging for a solution. His desperate gaze made it clear that he was well aware of the danger they were in. His family needed help, and I was the only one here who could offer any hope. I had no medical knowledge of animal poisonings, no specific antidotes, but I had lived in the woods long enough to know a few things. There were certain plants, certain herbs that could help fight toxins. But to find them in time, that was the real question. I needed to think quickly. "I'll do what I can," I whispered to the father bear, though I wasn't sure if he understood the words. It was the only thing I could say in that moment, a promise to a creature who had placed his trust in me. The bear paused, his posture softening for a brief moment. And then, just as quickly, he turned and moved toward the trees, looking back to ensure I was following. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the small satchel of tools I always carried with me, knives, small bags of herbs, bandages, and followed the bear into the woods. We moved swiftly, the forest around us closing in as the trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser. My mind was racing. I had to find the herbs quickly. Time was slipping away. Every moment I wasted could be the difference between life and death for the bears. The father bear led the way, guiding me through the forest as though he had done this before. He stopped in front of a patch of dense undergrowth and lowered his head, nudging aside the branches with his large paws to reveal a hidden patch of plants. I knelt down, recognizing the delicate green leaves of the herb I was searching for, yarrow. It was a powerful antidote to many poisons, and though it wasn't a guaranteed cure, it was the best chance I had. I quickly began to gather the yarrow, my hands moving with practiced speed. As I worked, I could feel the pressure of time pressing on me. The air felt heavy, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to succeed. I had no idea if I would be able to save them. But I had to try. There was no other choice. The yarrow leaves were cool against my hands, their scent earthy and slightly bitter. I worked as quickly as I could, but the pressure was mounting. The air in the forest felt thick, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I knew the poison was spreading in the bear's veins with every passing second, and I couldn't afford to waste time. The father bear stood behind me, watching, his large body almost blocking out the light as he loomed over me. His gaze was intense, but there was a quiet, unspoken trust in his eyes, an understanding that I was the last hope for his family. His steady presence was strangely calming, even in the face of the enormity of what lay ahead. I carefully pulled the leaves from the plants, stacking them in my satchel. The father bear did not move, not even as a gust of wind rustled the branches above us. His focus was entirely on me, waiting for my next move. It was as though he understood that I needed more than just the herbs. I needed time, and the forest itself seemed to grant me that gift, allowing me to work in peace. Once I had gathered enough yarrow, I stood up and turned toward him. "This should help," I said softly, though I wasn't entirely sure. Yarrow was known to reduce toxins in the body, but whether it would be enough for these bears, given the state they were in, was uncertain. The mother lay in the clearing, her fur still matted, her body motionless. The cub barely stirred, its tiny body limp and trembling. With one last glance at the father bear, I made my way back to the clearing, my heart heavy with the weight of what was ahead. As I knelt beside the mother bear, I felt her coldness again, a stark reminder of the poison that was ravaging her body. The cub, though still alive, was a mere shadow of what it should have been. I could see it in the way it clung to life, barely able to lift its head. The father bear remained a silent sentinel nearby, his eyes not leaving his family for a moment. He was waiting for me to act, for me to somehow turn the tide of fate. I could feel the depth of his trust, a silent promise that I would not fail them. I began preparing the yarrow. There were no exact measurements, no perfect recipe for this kind of medicine. The herbs needed to be crushed, their essence drawn out. My hands worked quickly, though my mind was filled with doubt. Would this be enough? Could I save them? The father bear's presence felt almost like a prayer. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the forest fill my senses. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the faint whisper of the wind, they all seemed to carry the weight of the moment. This was not just about saving a family of bears. It was about something larger, something deeper, an unspoken connection between us all. I gently pressed the crushed yarrow leaves against the mother bear's nose, hoping she would inhale the healing properties of the herb. Then, I moved to the cub, repeating the process, though I had to be gentler with it. The small body was frail, barely holding on. As I worked, I could feel the seconds slipping away, each one a reminder that the poison was still coursing through their veins. The forest held its breath, and I wondered if time itself had slowed down. I couldn't bear to look at the father bear, though I knew he was watching. I didn't want to see disappointment in his eyes. I had to believe that this could work. After what felt like an eternity, I leaned back and looked at the bears, unsure of what to expect. The mother remained still, her breathing shallow, but the cub, its tiny chest was rising and falling more steadily now. It was a small sign, a faint flicker of hope, but it was enough to make my heart race with anticipation. I turned toward the father bear, who had not moved an inch since I started. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something different, something other than desperation. It was a glimmer of hope. But the journey wasn't over. We had to wait. I stayed beside them, keeping a watchful eye on the bears, but my thoughts wandered. There was a deep connection between us, between the wild creatures of the forest and myself. They weren't just animals, they were part of the same world I had chosen to call home. I had helped them, but they had helped me too, teaching me to respect the fragile balance of life. As the hours passed, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting dappled light over the clearing. The mother's breathing had become steadier, though she still had not opened her eyes. The cub, too, was beginning to stir, its tiny body moving more freely, no longer trembling quite as much. I looked up at the father bear, who was still standing just beyond the clearing. He had not moved, but his posture had changed. There was no longer the tight tension of worry, no longer that pleading look. Now, he simply stood, a sentinel, watching over his family. It wasn't over yet, but there was hope. The hours stretched into what felt like an endless loop of waiting, each minute heavier than the last. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows across the clearing. The stillness of the forest seemed to deepen, as though even the trees themselves were holding their breath. It was the kind of quiet that made every rustle in the underbrush seem amplified, every bird call an omen. I sat beside the mother bear, my eyes fixed on her steady, shallow breathing. The cub, still nestled beside her, had begun to move more freely now, its tiny body no longer trembling with every breath. That faint flicker of hope had become a spark, a small, fragile flame that I clung to. The father bear had not moved since I applied the arrow, though I could feel his presence at the edge of the clearing, watching us with a kind of solemn patience. There was something incredibly humbling about it, how the great beast had trusted me, a human, to do what seemed impossible. The silence stretched on, and I couldn't help but wonder if the forest itself was waiting for something. Was this some kind of test? Would the poison relent, or would it claim the lives of these creatures before I could do anything to save them? I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat, studying the mother bear. She was still unresponsive, but the faint rise and fall of her chest was a good sign. Her color had returned somewhat, the pallor beginning to fade from her fur. The yarrow seemed to be doing its work, slowly but surely. A soft rustling in the distance broke my concentration, and I looked up quickly. There, emerging from the trees, was the father bear. He moved with careful grace, his large frame barely disturbing the underbrush. He wasn't rushing, wasn't frantic, just a slow, deliberate approach toward the clearing. I stood up, instinctively backing away from the mother and the cub. The father bear stopped just at the edge of the clearing, his eyes locking onto mine. There was something different in them now, something that wasn't just worry. It was gratitude. He was watching me, yes, but now, there was a sense of peace in his gaze. Without a sound, he turned his head to the mother and cub, and then back to me, as if offering an unspoken message. He wasn't just waiting for them to recover. He was thanking me for doing what I could. I swallowed the lump in my throat, unsure how to respond. What words could I say to a creature who had trusted me with his family's life? There was nothing I could say that would match the depth of what had passed between us. So, I did what felt right. I nodded. A small, silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between us. Then, without another word, the father bear slowly turned and began to move back into the woods, his massive form disappearing into the shadows. I watched him go, my heart heavy with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. He wasn't leaving out of anger or fear. No, he was simply stepping away, giving his family the space they needed to heal. I returned my attention to the bears. The cub was now sitting up, its small face looking curiously around, its movements more assured. The mother's eyes were still closed, but her breathing was steady, and I could feel the warmth returning to her body. It was a good sign. I remained there for a while longer, watching as the cub clambered to its feet, its legs still shaky but strong enough to support its weight. The mother remained still, but there was a subtle change in her, something that said she, too, was beginning to recover. The forest seemed to exhale, the weight of the silence lifting, and with it, a sense of peace I hadn't realized I had been holding on to. For the first time in hours, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. There was a long road ahead for the bears, of course. This would not be a quick recovery, but they had made it through the worst of it. They had survived. As the day began to fade into evening, I took one last look at the bears before turning back to the forest. The father bear was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered in the air, a reminder that, in the wild, even the fiercest creatures could trust, could hope, could allow themselves to rely on something or someone outside of their own strength. I had done my part. I could only hope that it had been enough. The night passed slowly, a quiet, watchful vigil beneath the stars. I didn't sleep, not fully. Instead, I kept my eyes on the bears, the mother's steady breathing the only reassurance that kept the darkness at bay. The cub had curled up beside her, its small body a soft, reassuring lump in the night. The moonlight bathed them in a silvery glow, highlighting the delicate dance between life and death that had been playing out in the clearing for so many hours. I could hear the night creatures stirring around me, owls hooting softly, the distant rustle of leaves as smaller animals moved about. But it was the silence of the bears that held me in place, the peace of their breathing a constant reminder of the fragile thread that bound us all to this earth. The father bear had not returned. I had expected him to, at least once, but he was either too far into the forest or simply giving his family the space they needed. Either way, I felt a quiet gratitude toward him for his patience. He had trusted me, but now he was allowing the healing process to unfold naturally, as it should. The first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the edges of the sky turning from deep blue to soft, pale pink. I blinked against the early morning light, stretching my stiff limbs. My back ached, my muscles sore from the hours of stillness, but I refused to leave. Not yet. I needed to see this through, to witness the change I had hoped for. And then, slowly, as though the very earth was waking up, the mother bear stirred. I held my breath, watching as her massive form shifted slightly. Her eyes fluttered open, the lids heavy but unmistakably awake. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the daylight, and for the first time since I had found her, she raised her head. The cub, sensing its mother's movement, gave a small squeak of joy and scrambled over to her, nudging her gently with its tiny snout. The mother's eyes softened as she gazed down at her cub, and for a long moment, they simply shared that look, the look of a mother who had been through hell and was now, miraculously, pulling through. My heart lifted, and I took a cautious step forward. The mother bear did not react immediately. I wasn't sure if she could sense my presence, or if she simply didn't care. Her world was focused on her cub, as it should be. But then, her gaze shifted to me, locking with mine for the briefest of moments. It wasn't fear or confusion in her eyes. It wasn't even gratitude. It was something simpler, something more primal, an understanding. And in that shared gaze, I knew she was okay. They were both going to make it. The forest had given us this gift, the gift of life, the gift of survival. I had helped, yes, but I knew that I wasn't the only reason they had pulled through. There was something ancient in the way the wilderness could heal itself, if only we had the patience to let it. The bears had fought, they had struggled, but they had also allowed themselves to trust the forest, the land that had always been their home. I smiled softly, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. My task here was complete, but there was no need for celebration. I had simply done what I could, and that was enough. There was no grand victory, no loud exclamations of success, just the quiet triumph of life against all odds. The cub playfully nudged its mother again, and this time, she responded, rising to her feet with a slow, deliberate movement. Her muscles were still stiff, but the energy returning to her was undeniable. The cub followed suit, shaky but determined, its tiny claws scraping against the earth as it wobbled after her. I stayed for a while longer, watching as they both made their way to the edge of the clearing, the mother's steps steady, the cub following close behind. The father bear was nowhere to be seen, but I had no doubt that he would find them soon. He didn't need to be here to see the change. He had already done his part. And as the bears disappeared into the forest, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't that I had saved them, it was that they had saved themselves, with the help of the land and the trust they had placed in me. I had been a part of their journey, and they had been a part of mine. The forest felt alive again, full of promise and possibility. The trees whispered their approval in the soft breeze, and I breathed deeply, letting the cool morning air fill my lungs. It was time to leave. The forest had healed, and so had I. The forest felt different as I walked away from the clearing, quieter somehow, as if the trees themselves were reflecting the peace. I had always been a part of this place, a silent observer to the comings and goings of the creatures who lived here. The bears, with their power and grace, had once been a distant, almost mythical presence. But now they were a part of me, too, woven into the fabric of my life in a way that couldn't be undone. As I made my way deeper into the forest, I felt a quiet understanding, one that had been growing in me for years. The land, the creatures, the seasons, they were all connected. Life here wasn't always easy. It wasn't always kind. But it was raw, and it was real. It demanded patience, respect, and understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, the creatures of the wild were willing to offer us the same. I had done what I could to help them, but in the end, the forest had healed them. The yarrow, the quiet care, and the simple act of being present, all of it had worked in tandem with the life force of the land. It was as though the forest itself had conspired to save the bears, giving them the strength to survive when it seemed like all hope was lost. The father bear had not returned to the clearing, but I wasn't concerned. He had done his part, leading me to his family, trusting me with the lives of those he loved. In his own way, he had known what needed to be done. And now they were free. I reached the small cabin I called home, a modest structure nestled in the heart of the woods. It was a simple life I led, but it was my own, surrounded by the wilderness I had always loved. I didn't need anything more than the land, the creatures, and the occasional visit. I paused at the threshold of the cabin, looking back toward the forest. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the sky. I wondered where the bears had gone, whether they had found a new place to rest, or whether they would continue their journey through the wilderness, their lives forever intertwined with the land. But it didn't matter. They were free now, and they had their lives ahead of them, as wild and untamed as the forest itself. A soft rustle behind me caught my attention, and I turned just in time to see a familiar figure step out from the trees. The father bear, silent as ever, appeared once more. He paused just outside the edge of the clearing, his massive frame standing tall and still against the backdrop of the darkening sky. He didn't approach any closer, just stood there, watching me. And in that moment, I realized that he had come to say goodbye. Not in words, but in his presence, in the quiet understanding that had passed between us all. I nodded at him, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we had shared. He had trusted me, and I had done my best to honor that trust. And now, it was time for him to go. With one final look, he turned and disappeared into the woods, as silently as he had come. I stood there for a long while, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me. The bears had left, but the forest remained. The life they had fought for was still pulsing through the trees, through the earth, through everything. I smiled softly, feeling a deep sense of contentment. The wilderness had given me something invaluable, the reminder that life, in all its wildness and unpredictability, was beautiful. And though I would never know exactly what became of the bears, I knew one thing for certain: the forest would always remember them, just as I would. And with that, I turned and stepped inside the cabin, the door closing softly behind me. The forest would continue to breathe, and so would I. Years passed, and the forest remained the same, ever-changing yet timeless, a living testament to the rhythms of nature. The cabin, once a quiet haven for a solitary forester, now stood quietly, its wood worn by the seasons, its walls lined with memories of those silent, sacred nights spent watching the stars above and the creatures below. I had grown older, my steps slower, but my heart still beat with the same connection to the wild world around me. The bears, though, had long since disappeared from my life. I never saw them again. The mother bear, who had trusted me with her life and that of her cub, had surely raised her young in the safety of the forest's embrace. The father, too, had gone on with his quiet strength, leaving behind only the memory of his presence in the trees. But I knew they were out there, somewhere, living their lives as they were meant to. The wilderness had given them a second chance, and in return, they had returned to the untamed world they knew so well. That was enough for me. That was always enough. I would sometimes walk through the woods, tracing the paths we had once shared, but the bears were no longer there. Instead, the forest greeted me with new faces, new families, new lives that had grown in the very soil the bears had walked upon. The circle of life continued in its quiet, unspoken way. The wilderness was a cycle, forever turning, forever moving forward. And as the seasons changed, so did I. I had learned many things during my time with those bears, but the most important lesson was that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer to those we help is simply to let them go. The forest had healed them in its own time, and now it was their turn to live, untethered by the past, free to walk the earth as they were always meant to. On quiet nights, I would sit on the porch of my cabin, the wind carrying the soft rustle of leaves and the distant calls of the creatures who had made this place their home. I would close my eyes and listen, letting the sounds of the forest fill me, and in those moments, I could almost hear the faintest echo of a bear's deep, rumbling growl, a sound not of danger, but of peace. It was the sound of a life lived well, a life returned to its rightful place in the wilderness. The forest would continue to whisper its secrets, and I would listen.